Hey, welcome to part 2 of my prop weapon mold tutorial. If you haven't watched part 1, then click here now. So, I've already put the fiberglass matting onto the first half of the mold. Now, what I used to do this was Scotch Super 77 spray adhesive. The spray adhesive just helps me keep the fiberglass stuck down onto the silicone, which makes it easier to put fiberglass resin on so it doesn't move around. The other thing I used was woven fiberglass mat, which I've cut into small strips or squares. I like to use the mat better just because it seems to hold shape a little bit better, and it's pretty easy to sort of lay down. So what I did was I took the spray adhesive and I sprayed a thin coat onto the first half of the mold, and then I laid down a layer of this woven fiberglass mat. Now I've done that up to 3 layers. You really only need 3 layers to make the shell strong enough, but I wouldn't do, if you want to make it stronger, I wouldn't do more than 3 layers at a time with the spray adhesive. The reason for this is that if you put too much spray adhesive down, it sometimes stops the fiberglass resin from being absorbed all the way through all the layers, and you end up with weak points where it has only sort of absorbed into the first 2 layers rather than all 3 or 4 layers that you put down. So make sure you only use this at 3 layers at a time, and then if you want to put more on, do it as a second batch on top. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to mix up some fiberglass resin, some polyester resin. I'm going to use some latex gloves, and I'm going to pour it onto all of this woven mat, and I'm going to use my hand to actually press the resin into the mat and help it just to make sure it absorbs all the way through. So now that I have my polyester resin mixed up, I'm going to pour it onto the fiberglass mat, and it's going to soak into the matting. When the fiberglass shell has cured, you can then start to clean it up and remove all the backing board. First thing you should do though is you should take some low grit sandpaper. This is 180 grit, and do a light sand around the outside. This just helps to get rid of any nasty, sharp, spiky bits that may have occurred on the surface. This is because the fiberglass strands, once they're soaked with the polyester resin, the fiberglass resin, any very thin strands will instantly turn into hard needles now, which is going to be very uncomfortable to hold. So give it a good sand on the outside with some low grit sandpaper. Make sure you do this outside because you don't want the dust to sort of fill up the room you're in. It's very bad for your lungs, so make sure you do this outside. And if you're not in a very well ventilated area, make sure you're wearing a respirator. So I'm going to sand the outside. Once you've finished sanding the outside, you can now flip it over, and you can start removing all the foam. And once you've removed all the foam, you can also go in and start peeling away clay. Should come off quite easily. If it doesn't, you can wipe it off. You should be able to wipe it off with a tissue. Just buff it, sort of almost like you're waxing it. Make sure you don't pull this first layer of silicone off of the other half of the blade or whatever you're molding, because if you do, sometimes it can either, when you try to put it back in, it'll either trap air or it won't sit perfectly straight the same way as it was, and it'll mess up the entire thing for you. So whatever you do, try not to touch the silicone too much. Try not to move around the silicone mold half too much, and definitely don't peel it off. So I'm going to remove all of this first, and then I'll tell you the next step. Okay, so here I've cleaned up the mold. I've taken all that foam backing off, and I've now also removed all of the clay that was around the edge that I put all the mold keys into, as well as that wall I put in the beginning. Now what you will notice is there is still some clay left in here, here, and here. That's because that's where my one pour spout is, and where my risers for the air, to allow air to pass through, are. You want to leave the clay in there, because if you don't leave the clay in, the next half of the silicone mold is just going to fill it up again and you won't have any of these parts anymore. So make sure you leave the clay into your pour spout and your risers. The next step, just to finish off and make this half of the mold jacket a little bit nicer, is just to trim off the edges a little bit. You can do this with a pair of scissors, because I haven't done it thick enough to make it too hard to cut. If you do make yours thicker than I have, and it is quite difficult to cut through, then you can also use a rotary tool like a Dremel to cut it off, cut off the excess. So I'm just going to cut off all the excess around here, and make sure you sort of round the edges, because otherwise if you have sort of sharp or pointed edges or corners, it can be quite painful actually if it catches you. So make sure you leave a little bit of space. I tend to leave sort of about an inch, maybe sometimes a little bit less if there isn't much anyways, but try to leave about an inch a border around your mold where you can. And there you go. That's your first half of the mold and your first half of the mold jacket, nice and cleaned up and finished. So now you're going to move on to making the second half of the mold. Okay, so now that you've got everything cleaned up and you're ready to do the second half, the first thing you make sure you need to do is to spray release onto it. So it's the same release, Man 200 is what I use. You can also use a spray wax or even paint on some melted Vaseline. So I'm going to spray this. Let's just make sure that the two layers of silicone don't stick together, because if that happens, then all the work you've done to make two halves is completely pointless. Once you've got your release sprayed on, you should leave it to dry, because Man 200 is actually a clear coat, and once it dries it's almost like a sort of plasticky film on top of your prop. Once it has dried, you'll be repeating the steps that you took for the first half of the silicone mold and the first half of the fiberglass jacket. So once you've poured the second half of the mold and you've done the second half of the jacket, you'll have this. So now I've done the second half of the silicone jacket. You see I've got all the keys in and everything, and hopefully I can show you here. It does actually split apart because of the fact that I sprayed a release onto it. So you can see hopefully here that it's starting to split apart. I'm not actually going to peel it all the way apart to show you because that can affect how sort of the second half of the fiberglass jacket sits. So hopefully you saw that. And now I'm going to do the second half of the fiberglass shell. The steps are pretty much exactly the same as the first half, except what you're going to want to do is, actually first, if there's any sort of excess silicone that's spilled off the edge, you can kind of just peel it off as you like, stuff like that, and bits here. But once you have it peeled off, what you're going to do to make sure the second fiberglass jacket doesn't stick to the first half is you're going to take some spray adhesive and you're going to take some aluminium foil or tin foil, and what you're going to do is you're going to spray this very lightly just to coat the outside of the fiberglass edge here. So very light coat, just enough to help you stick down your aluminium foil. Right, so all you then want to do is take out some aluminium foil, you don't need too much, rip it up into small strips. The edge isn't very wide, so I don't need it very thick, so I can probably rip it in half again. There you go. And then you just want to stick it right up against the edge, up to the silicone. This just stops the second half from actually touching the first half and should stop them from sticking together. You could also put some wax on the edge here instead, but I find this to be sort of the easiest and the cleanest way to do it. So I just fold that around the corner and I fold this back up to the edge of the silicone. So just make sure it's nice and right up against the edge, like so. You want to be doing this all the way around, and once you've got that done, you can start to lay down your second half. So once you've laid down the second half, you're going to get this. So now I've done the second half of the fiberglass shell and I'm pretty much finished with the entire mold now. The next step is to drill some holes. Now the holes will act as a way for me to line up the two shells and make sure everything is perfectly aligned. So basically I'm going to drill some holes, and then when I'm using this to cast, I'll have bolts through the holes screwed on to make sure this is nice and tight and in the right position. Now I have already trimmed up the edge. I did trim it with scissors, and I did not remove the shell first. I just trimmed it right up against the edge of the first half of the shell, so that they both should be pretty much exactly the same. I've also sanded down the outside just like last time as well, just to make it safer to hold and more comfortable to hold. So and I've done all of that without removing the shell or separating the shells. So now I'm going to drill some holes. I'm using a 4mm bit. That's only just because I have lots of 4mm bolts and nuts to go with them. So feel free to use whatever width drill bit you have for whatever amount of bolts you have, whatever size bolts you have. I'm just doing 4mm because I have lots of 4mm bolts. So I'm going to drill some holes. You don't need to be too excessive. I think I'm going to put 8 holes in total, 4 along this edge, 3 along here, 1 here, and then I'll spread the 4 on this edge out more evenly. So I'm going to do that. There you go, so I've got 8 holes in this in total. So now that I've done that, you can actually start to pull it apart. Sometimes it can be a bit difficult. You kind of need to just sort of work at it all the way around and sort of work some air in between the fiberglass shell and the silicone. But generally that comes off pretty well without too much trouble. Yeah, this is coming off. I can see the air running right into the mold. There you go. Yeah, as soon as it loses that vacuum suction and all the air goes in between the shell and the silicone, it loses everything that holds it together and it comes off really easily. So, you can start taking this apart. I would peel off one side. So this might have to be done slowly the first time just to know that it all is okay. There you go. And there you have it, your mold. It seems to have come out really well. There are no bubbles that I can see on the surface. The last step will be just to remove these bits of clay, which should just pop out really easily. See, just like that. It's brilliant. All of it's coming off quite easily. Exactly what I wanted. Last bit's giving a little bit of trouble. Come on. There you go. And there you have it. Your finished prop mold should turn out just like this, really nicely. 2 pieces that go together really well. There you go. I hope this video tutorial helps you guys make your own molds. I know I've learned a lot before I actually made this video, and I hope that what I've learned through my mistakes will prevent you guys from making your own mistakes and you know, wasting money on materials and things. Hey guys, I hope you liked that video and you learned something from it. Now, I only make these videos when I can think of something that I believe you would like to see or learn about in terms of prop making. Now, I can't think of everything, so if there's something you'd like to see, then feel free to leave a comment in the section below and suggest it. Now if you did like this video, and if you did learn something from it, and you'd like to learn more, then please like this video and subscribe to my channel. If you'd like to keep up to date with all of my other projects that I don't put on YouTube, then head over to my Facebook page over here and like it. Finally, if you'd like to see what props I have for sale, head over to my Etsy page and you can see all of that stuff. See you guys next time.